I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case. There are mornings in Oxford that persuade even the most cynical man that the world was designed for reflection. Not for happiness, God forbid, but for the sharper, quieter pleasure of noticing. A mist curled over the quadrangle that day, as if the college itself had decided to withdraw behind gauze. I remember standing beneath the cloisters, listening to the organ bleeding out from the chapel. The music was not Bach or Handel, nothing so triumphant, but a fugitive chord pattern that seemed to search for a resolution it never quite found. The sort of music I have always trusted. Unfinished, like most of us, Lewis was late. He usually was, though I had never held it against him. It gave me a chance to be alone with Oxford in the way I preferred, not in conversation with dons or students, but in communion with its stones, its archways, its ancient silences. The walls of St. Sepulchre's carried centuries of whispered confidences. One could almost hear the accumulated weight of them, pressing down into the flagstones. I had no case at that moment, no murder to occupy my thoughts. Only a folded newspaper abandoned on a pew. It lay as though someone had set it down mid-prayer and never returned. I took it up idly, smelling the faint trace of candle wax and damp wood upon its pages. The headline was small, almost buried, as if the editor himself doubted the story's merit. Woman still missing after 4 weeks. Clara Haldane, daughter of Professor Emeritus Julian Haldane. Last seen leaving a seminar on metaphysical poetry. I traced the words with a finger, as one might trace an inscription on a grave. Oxford loses women so quietly. They vanish not into violence, at least not always, but into the folds of obscurity. A girl slips from her college rooms, and the city swallows her. Someone files a report, and then the rain washes the chalk from the notice boards. I told myself it was not my concern, yet the words lingered as the organ continued its hesitant lament. The porter shuffled by, carrying a mop and bucket. His shoes squeaked against the stone, a sound oddly loud in that sanctified place. He glanced at me, then at the newspaper in my hands, and muttered something about lost things having a way of turning up when least expected. I wondered whether he spoke of umbrellas or of women. His eyes were clouded with the kind of loyalty one sees in men who have served too long in one place. I stored the remark away, though it meant little then. Lewis arrived eventually, his cheeks flushed with the brisk air, apologizing for traffic as though traffic could truly exist in Oxford. He remarked on the music. I told him it was aimless, and perhaps that was why I liked it. He asked me if I had seen the morning's paper. I held it up, already folded to the page he meant. He said there had been another development, but he would explain later over coffee when the porter was out of earshot. I made a wry remark about secrets, though in Oxford such remarks are always redundant. What held me in that moment was not the story of the missing woman, nor even the porter's muttered philosophy, but a single word in the article that struck me as misplaced. The reporter had written that Clara had absconded. It was a legalistic word, more suited to debtors and deserters. One does not abscond from a seminar unless one has stolen something. I found myself rereading the sentence, turning the word upon my tongue. It was the sort of detail that meant nothing, or everything. The organ fell silent at last, leaving the air oddly bereft. I folded the newspaper again, this time more carefully as if it deserved respect. A crow perched on the parapet above, its feathers wet with mist, and regarded me with the suspicion crows reserve for men who stand too still. Lewis asked whether we were truly concerned with a disappearance already 4 weeks cold. I told him almost truthfully that I had no such concern. Yet the truth was simpler and less comfortable. I was already ensnared by a word, by a silence, by a melody that had refused to resolve. Oxford is full of such beginnings. They wait in the damp stone, patient as ivy, until one is foolish enough to listen. And I listened. Coffee at the lodge tasted of wet string. The porter, solemn as a verger, drew a single sheet from beneath the counter and placed it between a bowl of old keys and the register. "Found this morning," he said, "tucked behind the notices about supervisions and silence after 10. No envelope, only paper that had learned the smell of polish." I read it twice before allowing myself opinion. The hand leaned right, elegant but tense. The tails of G and Y tugged thin. A few lines about crossing dark water and keeping courage, not to anyone named, but to a you that felt confessional. Beneath, a plain sentence said that a key would be in the usual place. Lewis called it theatre. "Students adore rehearsing disasters," he said. I told him tragedy requires memory, and memory is rarely tidy. My unease lay in the borrowing. Half a stanza from Tennyson, yet the writer gave soundless where I knew speechless, and softened a preposition as though hoping to pass among the half-rememberers. The daughter of an emeritus professor is not often careless with famous lines. I asked for the register. The porter, dutiful and unhappy, slid it over. The day's entries were inked, save for one penciled name, faint and then crossed through, as if presence had wished to be reversible. Along the margin the porter had jotted plate numbers. One ended with letters that did not belong to the county the driver claimed when asking directions. Lewis missed it. He was admiring the porter's penmanship. On the reverse corner of the sheet, someone had sketched a key with 3 teeth. Not art, merely an aid memoir, but the teeth fell into a pattern. Long, short, long, that echoed the rhythm of the misremembered line. A mind thinking in metre while worrying about locks. We searched the usual places colleges make for themselves, under the flower pots by her staircase, inside the hollow pedestal that once held a bishop, beneath the loose radiator grill in the JCR that everyone pretends not to know. Dust, a receipt for indifferent wine, 2 cigarette ends that had given up their secrets to a cleaner days before. Oxford hides not with ingenuity, but with repetition. The obvious becomes invisible. Rain began its patient embroidery across the quad, and I asked Lewis for the indulgence of the choir. He promised himself a pie and permitted me a hymn. In the loft a treble drifted on a vowel, until the choirmaster cut him gently. Speechless, not soundless. The correction entered the air like a small mercy. I felt that quiet tremor that comes when error touches echo. Whoever wrote the note had heard the wrong word often enough for it to grow roots. On our way out I asked who first handled the page. "A scout," said the porter, then one of the junior fellows, then perhaps both. His loyalty, like most sincere loyalties, was muddled. He locked up for evensong. The corridor gave its wooden complaint, a sound of houses breathing. We kept the paper. I folded it once, so as not to break the sentence about the key. Somewhere a usual place waited with its own notion of usual, because the word is a circle, not a point. I carried the sheet in my coat, and felt that disproportionate weight a page can acquire when it speaks both too much and too little. Evening narrowed the sky to a thought I preferred not to complete, and still I could smell the polish, the dust, and the wrong word. A deduction presented itself while Lewis spoke of pie and porters. Usual place reads like a crossword instruction. Not here, but habit. Take the common, drop the ornament. The penciled visitor, the county that did not fit its letters, the choir's correction, all 3 murmured routine. Someone had hidden meaning inside what everyone overlooks. It is an odd profession, piecing together the life of someone already half vanished. The voice you seek has thinned to rumour. The gestures remembered only in fragments. What remains are others' recollections, and recollections are treacherous things. Clara Haldane had disappeared a month before my steps first echoed in St. Sepulchre's. She had been seen last leaving a seminar room in the upper quadrangle, carrying a satchel of papers that never surfaced again. The police had done their duty, questioned the porter, spoken with the dons, asked the usual questions about money and lovers. What they brought away was little more than the certainty that she was gone. I began with her father. Julian Haldane lived on the edge of the parks, in a house whose curtains had not been changed since Harold Wilson's first premiership. He had retired from professorship, but not from the tone of it. His speech was a kind of lecture delivered to no one in particular. He told me his daughter was gifted, moody, obstinate, that she had read Don with more passion than prudence, that she had inherited his mind but not his patience. He looked past me as though I were an inattentive student. When I asked about her last weeks, he mentioned letters arriving with no sender, anonymous advice about keeping her distance from certain men of the college. He waved a hand as if to dismiss them, but I noticed the gesture ended too sharply, as if the dismissal were aimed at himself. The colleague came next. Edmund Wharton, a fellow in literature who occupied rooms lined with books he had never quite managed to read. He spoke of Clara as clever but unformed, a girl drawn too easily to brilliance in others. He said her father had been overprotective, jealous of any influence that did not bear his surname. He admitted that Clara had visited him for advice, though the advice had concerned nothing more dangerous than dissertation topics. I watched his fingers move constantly across the spines behind him, as though the books themselves could confirm his innocence. His desk held a crossword half-finished, with the word abscond written vertically. To coincidence, perhaps, but the choice of clue stayed with me. The lecturer with debts was different. Paul Vernon, handsome in a careless way, had perfected the smile of a man who intends to be forgiven. He told me Clara had been bright, occasionally mocking, too quick to see through pretense. He laughed when he said it, but his laughter was brittle. His alibi was a pub on the Botley Road, where half a dozen could vouch for him. Still, his account was polished too smoothly, like silver that has lost its engraving. There was also the porter, Mason, the one with the cloudy eyes and the habit of listening too closely. He said she had often returned late, always polite, never hurried. Once he had heard her humming a tune, though he could not remember which. He described her coat as green, though another insisted it was grey. Such small contradictions are the dust of investigations. Too light to grasp, yet enough to coat the lungs. And then the student Eleanor Grant, who shared lectures with Clara. She was the kind who spoke carefully, as if each word were a currency not easily earned. She said Clara had been admired, even envied, not least for her way of moving through a room as if searching for someone absent. Eleanor spoke of a quarrel at the seminar, an argument about interpretation, though she would not say with whom. When pressed, she remarked that Clara never lost arguments, only people. The remark carried more weight than she intended, perhaps. What I learned from these encounters was less about Clara than about the shadows she cast. Each of them spoke in tones that revealed more about their own hunger than about her. The father desperate to preserve an image, the colleague clinging to propriety, the lecturer seeking absolution, the porter desiring intimacy, the student balanced between admiration and resentment. As dusk drew over the spires, I wrote her name on a blank sheet and stared at it until the letters blurred. Clara, bright clear, a name that promises translucence, yet what I found was only opacity. She had disappeared, yes, but not into thin air. She had disappeared into the minds of others, where she had been translated, mistranslated, and finally lost. It struck me then that in each account her presence was described with verbs of movement: left, visited, returned, quarrelled. Never once was she said to have stayed. A woman who never stayed is always on the verge of vanishing. I carried the note with me into the library, for I wanted a room that smelled of vellum and dust to tell me what I already half suspected. Libraries are honest places. They preserve not truth but memory, and memory is at least more interesting. The page bore its line like a bruise, the charge of the Light Brigade, though disfigured. Into the valley of soundless death, not speechless. Not the word Tennyson set there with his hand. Someone had replaced it gently, almost plausibly, as if one syllable could slip past centuries unremarked. I tried the word aloud, under my breath. Soundless. It was softer, less final. Speechless leaves the throat closed, a silence imposed. Soundless is an emptiness without beginning. Whoever wrote the note had not misremembered. They had preferred. That was the distinction. Lewis looked over my shoulder and muttered that poets never made sense to him. He asked if it mattered. One word in a line hardly anyone reads with attention. I told him that mistakes matter, because they are never quite mistakes. They belong to someone. He shrugged, and the sound of his shoes moved away down the aisle. I thought then of Clara. Had she written the note herself? A girl of sharpness and irony, raised in the company of books. Could she have altered a line deliberately as a kind of signature? Or had the hand belonged to someone else, someone who carried the wrong word about with him like a secret emblem? On the desk nearby was a volume of Tennyson annotated in different hands, layers of scholarship pressed one upon another. One reader had crossed out valley and replaced it with silence. Another had corrected the correction. A palimpsest of errors and restorations. The page, I realized, resembled the girl's story, told, retold, amended, erased. Later, over a pint in the King's Arms, I heard a Don misquote the same line in conversation with another. He said soundless too, casually, as though the word had always been there. His companion let it pass. I marked his voice, the unthinking confidence of repetition. That evening I could not remember his name, only the way he stirred his glass when he thought no one was watching. The crossword that day in the Times offered a clue I lingered on. 5 letters, dumb. The solution could be mute or still or even mum, all synonyms of absence, but each carried its own shade. I circled it absently, struck by how language insists upon its own nuance. If one substitutes, one also reveals. In the days that followed, I began to notice the misquotation in small corners. A student humming it as though it were a lyric, a fellow correcting a paper and repeating it half under his breath. The word had spread like lichen, clinging where memory falters. I wondered whether Clara had been drawn to the word's gentleness, or whether someone had offered it to her. Perhaps in conversation, until it became habitual. Such contagions of language bind people more intimately than gestures. A private vocabulary, their shared flaw. And so the note, which at first seemed theatrical, began to suggest intimacy. Whoever wrote it had either spoken closely with her or sought to mimic the speech she knew. Either way, it carried more than despair. It carried attachment. I kept the paper in my pocket, as one keeps a key whose lock is yet undiscovered. The ink smudged faintly at the fold, but the word endured, soft and deliberate. Not wrong at all, but chosen. When I left the library that night, rain polished the cobbles to a mirror. I walked home slowly, rehearsing lines I had no need to recite, feeling the pull of that single syllable echoing in the cloisters. Soundless. A word that did not belong to Tennyson, but to someone else entirely. And perhaps now to me, evening folded itself over St. Sepulchre's. Rain tightened the quad. Lamps put pale coins on the flags. In the senior common room the curtains were closed, as if daylight had been a vulgar guest. Sherry arrived, and with it the people I needed, the porter hovering near the door. Wroughton spoke first. Essays, he said. A long afternoon of them. His door left open so Oak could witness. He asked about the note. I told him it existed. His nod came too quickly, the agreement of a man keeping time with music he could not hear. His hand drifted toward the decanter, retreated, and pretended it had always wanted only the glass. Vernham took the mantle with the ease of someone for whom furniture behaves. He described Clara with a careful generosity that nearly passed for kindness. Too clever for patience, he said, fond of mischief when mischief could wound the vein. He surrendered the pub on the Botley Road, the darts, the gin, the witnesses. As if by accident, he added that the porter had once found Clara walking the corridors near midnight, humming the famous line with the wrong word that has wandered through the college. He smiled as if the word belonged to him. Eleanor kept to the edge of the firelight, self-contained. There had been an argument after a seminar, she said. Smoke without flame. She would not give me an opponent. Clara was preparing herself for alteration, leaving something, perhaps not the city. She said all this without display, and that was what convinced me. When they left, the room exhaled. Lewis, Suspicious of velvet, brought me the register the porter keeps for visiting cars. Colleges take plates as hotels take signatures, he said, and signatures remember. One entry from the previous night ended with letters born in a northern county, yet the porter had written west in the column for direction of travel. Nothing, and therefore interesting. Habit is a better script than intention. I poured another inch. On the hearth essays weighted with paper clips like small restraints. I opened the top sheaf. Tennyson again, argued with undergraduate certainty. In the margin a different hand had amended the notorious line, speechless, not soundless. A small disciplined E sat beside the correction. If Eleanor had written it, she knew where accuracy hurts. If not, another attentive reader kept loyal company with error. From the chapel a thread of sound reached us and made the room breathe. In that ribbon I heard the misquotation arrive half a beat late, lovely and wrong. I thought of Vernon's benevolence, how men who polish manner also polish memory until its engraving thins. At the sideboard a bowl for the SCR charity kept a dish of matches from the Randolph. While speaking of darts, Vernon had turned one match over his knuckles with a boy's impatience. Darts, gin, and an unnamed hotel. A small triangle of conveniences. Hotel registers are less sentimental than porters' columns. I remembered the penciled name in the lodge book, then crossed out. Presents rehearsed and withdrawn. Lewis asked what tied any of it to Clara. Habit, I said, aware of its thinness. Yet the evening had set a still life before us, a correction initialed E, a smile too carefully lit. A car travelling north while pretending west. A matchbook that prefers bedrooms to chalk. They did not touch. They shared a palette. One keeps colours near until the picture arrives. At the doorway the boards made their old confession. The porter lowered his voice to say a key was mislaid. The small brass for the side stair, nothing to trouble gentlemen. I thanked him, stepped into the rain and watched the lamps shrug off their halos. In my pocket the note lay folded against my palm. I felt the ridge of the sketched key, long, short, long, a metronome for patience. It is easy in such air to mislay a life among politeness, to buff edges until guilt loses its grain. I promised myself a visit to the Randolph in the morning, and the hope that contradiction warmed might speak. The Bodleian at dusk has its own temperament. A silence not of absence but of accumulated thought. Dust rises gently when one lifts a volume, as if memory itself had grown tired of concealment. I went there not in search of revelation, but of distraction. Yet what I found was the opposite. The librarian guided me to a cabinet of college archives, photographs pressed between tissue as though they might still bruise. One image, curled at the edges, showed Clara at perhaps 8 years of age, her face arranged in solemn obedience beside her father. To the right sat another figure, a man not named in the index. His outline had been neatly halved. Scissors had made the decision years ago. I looked at the torn margin more than I looked at Clara. Children in photographs have a way of appearing timeless, whereas absence insists on explanation. Someone had wished to excise, but in excising had only underlined. Lewis asked whether it was worth troubling about an old family snapshot. People cut pictures for reasons of vanity, not conspiracy. I told him vanity is never quite so industrious with scissors. The edge was careful, not angry. Whoever removed the figure wished the story to continue without the embarrassment of a character. We searched the folder further. Among the programs and letters I found a diary page, half torn, its middle lost. The remaining lines were domestic enough, music rehearsals, a doctor's appointment, yet a single phrase lingered, supper with J. The missing center left the name in suspension. I saw that the tear in the photograph and the tear in the diary shared a kind of symmetry. Both removed not the past, but its witness. Lewis frowned, speaking of coincidences. But coincidences weary me less than their denials. I asked him what he saw in Clara's face. He said sadness. I saw scrutiny, the eyes of a child aware that the camera lies, and perhaps willing it to lie less successfully. Later in the gallery, I overheard two students debating a riddle from that day's crossword. 4 letters, clue. The answer, they argued, must be hint. Yet one maintained it could be clue, the old word for a ball of thread. Their voices tangled as they circled definition. So I smiled inwardly, for it seemed exactly the point. A clue is not an answer. It is only a thread, and this photograph was no different. Back in the reading room, I placed the photograph under the lamp. The ink of the index had bled faintly with age, but beneath the script I thought I could see another word, half erased, Wroughton. The fellow of literature, his name written once, then blotted out. Perhaps the torn figure was his, perhaps not, but the echo of his presence troubled the silence, more than the certainty would have. I imagined Clara years later, walking those same aisles, stumbling across the same torn memory. Would she have recognized the absence, or merely turned the page? Perhaps her disappearance was less sudden than we all believed, an education in erasure that began in childhood. Lewis grew restless, as he always did, when the trail refused to deliver bodies or fingerprints. He asked what I intended to do with half a photograph and a diary missing its middle. I told him to file them where all evidence truly belongs, between suspicion and patience. He thought I was joking. I was not. When the librarian extinguished the lamps, I remained a moment longer, tracing the outline of the child's small hand clutching her father's sleeve. The gesture looked protective, though which of them sought protection was impossible to tell. Outside, the evening rain tapped the leaded windows. Oxford, indulgent in its secrecy, closed itself for the night. I carried the torn photograph in my coat, feeling the edge where scissors had cut clean. There are absences that weigh more than presence, and this one pressed against me as I walked away from the library. Less a picture than a question in cardboard disguise. I have never trusted answers that arrive prettily wrapped, yet that evening I tied my own ribbon with practiced hands. It felt inevitable, which is almost always the first error. The note with its graceful hand, the wrong word that had colonized the college, the penciled guest who had second thoughts about existing, the matchbook from the Randolph slipping from Vernham's pocket, these gathered into a picture that did not resist me. I told Lewis that Clara had staged her exit. Not for drama. She was cleverer than that. For control, perhaps, or for the pleasure of commanding the gaze without returning it. She wrote the note, I said, trusting the misquotation as a private emblem. She left the hint of a key because secrets taste sweeter when shared with a chosen few. She booked a room under a faintly altered name, pencil ready for erasure. She took a car whose plate disliked its county, and drove north while telling the register she went west. Lewis listened with the patience of a man who has folded too many of other people's clothes. He asked whether a girl so precise would trust a lodge notice board. I replied that precision occasionally borrows recklessness and calls it bravery. He mentioned cameras and cards and the thread of receipts that fixes a person to the pavement. I answered that Oxford still mislays the present, borrowed sofas, back stairs, friends who do not ask. To confirm myself, I walked to the Randolph. Hotels confess by ledger and habit. The clerk remembered a woman of Clara's colouring, though he remembered colouring in the way clerks do, as an impressionist blur. Her registration in pencil survived, and had been scored through with a quick line. The initials were CH, though the H might have been an A with second thoughts. A room had been paid in cash for 2 nights, and occupied only once. I wanted to be satisfied, and for a moment I permitted the ease. Back at college, the porter spoke in the lowered tone of a man describing weather. He had found the small brass key for the side stair. It had rolled beneath a radiator, where heat keeps mislaid things lingering. I asked who used that stair most. Fellows, he said, and choristers who forget the right door. Sometimes Miss Grant when the main flight was crowded. In my rooms I poured whiskey and set the evidence upon the table like a chess endgame. The note, the torn photograph, the diary page with its middle gone, the matchbook, the penciled registration, the plate whose letters denied their county. I said aloud that Clara had made a theatre of vanishing. She rehearsed absence as others rehearse arias. She left the word soundless like a pressed flower. Fair token to assure me she was choosing absence. Yet the small e in the essay intruded, the disciplined correction that restored speechless with a surgeon's economy. The choirmaster's soft insistence on the right word returned to me. The porter had hummed the wrong one. Contagions do not name their origin without effort. As the glass thinned, so did my argument. I opened the day's crossword and found a clue I had ignored. 7 letters, meaning a pleasing lie. I wrote seeming and disliked its posture. I wrote chimera and admired its arrogance. The grid refused each, but the sensation of near rightness, persuasion without proof, was the model of my theory. It fit until one pressed a finger to the seam. Sleep came late and without fidelity. I dreamed the photograph restored, the halved figure pasted back, his mouth forming a word I failed to catch. Morning would shake my contrivance, I felt it. Still, I let the tidy story warm me through an hour not meant for warmth. When I woke, Oxford had made a damp new decision. The choir practiced early. A note travelled through stone and arrived altered, censored by distance. I understood. My solution had suffered in the journey from desire to fact. It would not withstand the next conversation. But for a night it held, and in that holding I recognized the oldest temptation in my trade, to prefer coherence to truth and call it deduction. It never quite felt earned. It was in the chapel that the case betrayed me. Not in the records, nor the registers, nor the diary with its amputated middle, but in the body of a voice that forgot itself for half a measure. The rehearsal had drawn me there by accident. Lewis, still disbelieving my theatre of explanations, preferred a pint, but I lingered in the shadows of the loft. The treble's voices broke against the stone, all innocence and strain, while the organ shuffled obediently beneath them. And then one note sustained into the wrong vowel, the substitution almost graceful, soundless again where speechless should have stood. The choirmaster stopped with the patience of a man who has corrected the same child for weeks, not soundless, speechless. He repeated it softly, as though caressing the truth back into place. The boy nodded, embarrassed, but I scarcely watched him. I felt instead the slow unwinding of my earlier solution, that carefully tied ribbon slipping loose in my hands. The wrong word was not Clara's, it was the college's. It belonged to the air itself, to anyone who had heard it often enough to adopt it unconsciously. I remembered then Vernham by the fireplace, smiling as he told me she had hummed it. Wroughton tracing spines as if words could absolve him. Even the porter, his cloudy eyes narrowed in recollection. Each had repeated the error without suspicion, and I, lazy, eager for symmetry, had chosen to imagine it as her signature. The soprano began again, this time corrected, the word restored. Yet I could not hear the truth without hearing also the ghost of its error. Soundless pressed itself into me, more insistent than rightness. I left the chapel before the hymn resolved, unwilling to let the children's voices repair what the case had already broken. In the quad, dusk spread its ink across the stone. The rain returned with that thin Oxford persistence, less weather than mood. I thought of Clara, her face scrutinizing the camera in the torn photograph. She had not absconded into absence by her own script. Someone else had scripted her. Lewis found me under the cloister. "You look like a man who's heard confession," he said. I told him only that a choir boy had made a better detective than I. He laughed, thinking it a jest, but I had already begun to redraw the lines, the penciled registration in the Randolph ledger, so easily crossed through. A car with letters that denied its county. The porter humming late at night. These were not Clara's inventions. They were borrowings, clumsy masks fitted with borrowed words. The note was no flourish of disappearance, but a disguise, someone else's hand dressing itself in her cadence. Lewis asked if I was ready to discard my theory so quickly. I said that quickness had nothing to do with it. The choir had undone me in a single vowel, but truth seldom requires more. He muttered about vagueness, about detectives who put faith in hymns. I told him hymns remember longer than witnesses. We walked back through the college, where the corridors bent into one another like half-formed recollections. Somewhere above, the organ coughed into another prelude. The air smelled of candle grease and damp paper, that scent which suggests scholarship and secrecy in equal measure. I carried the note in my pocket, its wrong word now less a clue than a signature of someone else's ambition. At my desk later, I opened the day's crossword. 6 letters borrowed identity. I penciled alias, then erased it. Mask would fit as well. Cloak, too. The setter had been generous with options, as life occasionally is. I stared at the blank squares until I could no longer remember which answer I preferred. When I closed my notebook, Oxford's bells were already quarrelling with midnight. The soprano's missung word still echoed in my ear, a mistake repeated so faithfully it had become a truth of its own. And in that echo I felt the first certainty of the case. Clara had not written the note. Morning arrived without faith and settled on the city like a thin dust. I unfolded the note at my desk and studied it, as one studies a tired face, hunting the place where performance gives way. The rightward slant remained confident. The pressure slackened whenever the letter E appeared, a faint retreat of ink that looked oddly personal. I imagined a hand trained to copy rather than confess. It resembled Clara's cleverness without her bite. Lewis came with coffee and a box released from Haldane's grudging custody. Inside the box lay a failed fountain pen, a sheaf of lecture notes, and 3 spiral-bound notebooks of crosswords. I opened the first. Puzzles soothe men who distrust consolation. They promise a justice the world counteroffers only rarely. Clara solved with surgical calm. Her marginalia catalogued Setter's vices: anagrand lazy, link word padded, homophone thin. Earlier grids teemed with doodles, small compasses, fragments of stave. As the weeks approached her disappearance, the grids became severe. Letters sat like stones in old walls. Crossings brokered no play. It was not unhappiness I saw, but purpose with its place chosen. The last notebook held a grid titled, in pencil, Sepulchre. The date belonged to that troublesome week. I read the across answers for acrostic mischief and found nothing but thrift. I read the downs and watched a name compose itself from the first letters. Mason. It stood without apology. The porter's name, threaded vertically through a pastime designed to conceal. Not an accusation. There is an elegance to accusation she rarely allowed herself, but a flare fired discreetly. Lewis offered coincidence with a policeman's kindness. Mason is a short word, he said. English is a garden of them. I told him acrostics are not gardens. They are corridors. He asked if I meant that they lead somewhere. I said only that they are built to narrow choices. He looked at the page again and did not touch it. We returned to the library. The photograph waited in its tissue, the right-hand figure erased. Beneath the sleeve, an index card had been amended by a neat older hand. Choir supper, stair A. Stair A belonged to the small brass key that had wandered under a radiator. I examined the faces until the porter's younger gaze met mine. It seemed directed a fraction to the side of the lens, toward someone standing just outside permission. On a nearby shelf sulked the Book of Benefactions, pious as an old sermon. I found Haldane's recent redirection of a bequest to a chorister's scholarship. Charity is not suspicion. I wrote it anyway. Its timing whispered against the unsigned letters he had waved away like smoke. Money remembers where words pretend to forget. By mid-afternoon, the rain had tuned the paving stones. I opened the day's crossword and found a clue with intimacy. 10 in chapel missung, holding truth. 7. I wrote chanted, disliked it, then saw 2 10s enclosed by C for chapel, C1010. Content. Concealed truth, satisfaction, the quiet glow of something correctly placed. I thought of the choir's vowel restored. The difference between benign error and deliberate borrowing. The grid felt like an instruction and I allowed it. We carried the notebooks to Haldane. He stood rigidly in a drawing room that collected thunder. Clara liked games, he said. Clara liked being right. When I asked whether anyone frightened her, he admired the carpet until time weakened my question. Grief, when it is proud, resembles contempt. I left him to his curtains. Night encouraged the simple audacities. I wrote Mason at the top of my notebook and underlined it once, not a verdict, only a light above a stare. Returning to Clara's pages, I noticed faint writing impressed on the final sheet. I shaded gently with a soft pencil until the ghost consented to return. Usual place, choir stair, after complain. The words surfaced like drowned things, briefly permitted breath. I closed the book. Outside, the city poured itself into gutters, resigned and methodical. Somewhere a soprano practiced a single vowel until it stopped betraying her. The case had not yielded a solution, merely a direction. That is usually enough, though it rarely feels like mercy. There are days when Oxford yields its secrets less through discovery than fatigue. One looks long enough, and eventually something gives way. That afternoon, in the hush of the Bodleian Annex, it was not revelation but paper tired of silence. The torn photograph had troubled me for days. Clara as a child, her father at her side, the excised figure leaning into the family tableau only to be scissored out with care. I returned to it with the obstinacy of a man unwilling to permit scissors the last word. A second folder, misplaced in the catalogue, contained a duplicate print, its edges untouched. And there she was, a woman with hair pinned back severely, her gaze caught in the unflinching lens. Lewis said she looked stern. I said she looked remembered. The librarian whispered her name as if it were forbidden still. Margaret Vale, once colleague, once confidant of Haldane. The margins of the university forget many things, but photographs are less obedient. It did not take much to learn that Vale and Haldane had quarrelled, bitterly, theatrically, when Clara was young. Their disagreement concerned more than scholarship. There were hints of an attachment spurned, of loyalty divided, of a child caught between rival affections, and then silence. The photograph cut, the name removed, the woman relegated to the unindexed drawer. I found in the same file a letter folded twice, its ink faded but not gone. Written in Vale's neat hand, it asked only that Clara be permitted visits. Not often, not publicly, only sometimes when the girl was willing. The tone was restrained, yet it throbbed with the kind of grief that makes restraint crueler than indulgence. No reply was included. Silence can be an answer more permanent than refusal. Lewis shook his head. Families are private wars, he said. What has it to do with disappearance? I told him everything, though I could not yet explain why. Absence repeats itself. Clara had inherited that fluency. A woman cut from a photograph. A diary sheared of its middle. A daughter swallowed whole. Later, walking through the cloisters, I remembered Eleanor Grant's remark that Clara never lost arguments, only people. At the time it had seemed no more than cleverness. Now it rang like confession by proxy. Clara's life had been an education in abandonment. The mother she scarcely saw. The father more lecturer than parent. The mentors who admired without protecting. Small wonder she trusted puzzles more than people. Puzzles at least permitted resolution. At dinner that night in Hall, I watched Wroughton cross the floor to speak with Vernon. The conversation appeared casual, but Wroughton's hand touched his glass before lifting it, a pause too deliberate. It was a gesture I had seen before, in the torn photograph, Margaret Vale's hand resting just so on the child's shoulder, as if rehearsing steadiness. Habits of gesture are more faithful than words. In that symmetry I felt the past pressing into the present. On my napkin I wrote the clue from the crossword that morning, 8 letters, meaning concealed history. I tried palimpsest, it fit. I left it there. Lewis grew impatient with my silence. He asked whether I thought Vale had returned, whether she sought revenge, whether Clara had gone to her. I said only that revenge is a blunt instrument, and Vale had been a precise woman. More likely someone else had carried the quarrel forward, unknowing repeating absence as inheritance. When I left Hall, the rain had slicked the cobbles into sheets of dark glass. A student passed, humming a hymn with the wrong word again, soundless instead of speechless. I almost stopped him, but what would correction serve? Errors persist, not because they are true, but because they are useful. Back in my rooms, I laid out the photograph uncut beside its mutilated twin. Clara's small hand clutched her father's sleeve in both, but in the restored version, her eyes met Vale's with a trust that unsettled me. Trust denied its continuance curdles into bitterness, and bitterness leaves sharper traces than love. I poured whiskey, listened to the rain bruise the window panes, and felt the case lean toward its conclusion. The past had emerged, yes, but it was not finished speaking. It never is. Oxford lives on such revenants, and so do I. It was Lewis who called me from my solitude, his voice unsteady over the receiver. They had found her, not in river nor meadow, but within the college itself, sealed behind a passage that builders had long forgotten to mention in plans. St. Sepulchre's had swallowed its own secret, until rain loosened stone and released the smell that tells truth. Better than witnesses, I went at once. The stairwell was narrow, smelling of lime and rust. The door had been disguised as part of the wall, paint faded into plaster. Inside, the air was close, stale, with months of silence. Clara lay there, folded gently as though someone had feared breaking her. No struggle marked the stone. Death had arrived not with clamour, but with the terrible courtesy of suffocation. Lewis muttered curses, then apologies for them. I touched the wall instead, rough under my hand, as if texture might answer the questions her body no longer could. Our college hides many things, its debts, its indiscretions, its students who leave without degree or explanation. But to hide the dead is a cruelty that feels almost deliberate. The porter stood nearby, his cloudy eyes refusing mine. He said little, too little. His words moved as if chosen from a rehearsed catechism. She was frightened. She laughed at me. I only wanted quiet. The note had been his invention, the wrong word his disguise. He had heard it sung often enough to trust it would not betray him. He wrote with her cadence because he thought it beautiful. His shame was not in what he had done, but in how poorly it imitated love. Lewis asked me later how I knew. I told him I did not until the choir corrected the boy's vowel. A misquotation betrayed him as neatly as fingerprints. The rest had been patience, the penciled registration, the matchbook, the key beneath the radiator. All threads waiting to be tugged. We stood in hall while police carried her away. The organist practiced softly, as though hymns could disinfect stone. Students whispered, donning solemnity like borrowed gowns. I poured myself a glass of indifferent claret and listened to the rain bite the windows. Lewis said justice had been done. I said nothing. Justice is too blunt a word for such silences. I thought of Clara's crosswords, her corrections, her quiet certainty that puzzles at least rewarded attention. She had left her own acrostic Mason spelled down the margins. It had not saved her, but it had spoken. I wondered if she knew it would. Perhaps she trusted that someone would read what others only glanced at. That faith shamed me more than the porter's confession. In my rooms, I unfolded the torn photograph once more. Clara's small hand clung to her father's sleeve. Her gaze sought the woman erased from memory. Absence had been her inheritance long before she vanished. To die in silence behind stone was only the last repetition of what life had rehearsed too well. I solved the crossword that evening without satisfaction. The final clue read end without end 4. The answer, of course, was echo. It seemed fitting. Cases end, bodies buried, yet the sound remains, softened but persistent. Clara's voice, misquoted into silence, would remain in the corridors of that college, long after Lewis and I had retired our weariness. As midnight settled, I poured whiskey and let the glass mist my hand. The rain slackened, the bell stuttered once, then yielded. I thought of her name, clear as water now written among the vanished. Oxford would continue as it always has, cloisters breathing, choirs correcting, porters guarding keys. And I would continue too, hearing echoes more often than voices, content only in the knowledge that I had listened. I left the glass unfinished. Some thirsts do not deserve quenching.